Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll let people pop on, and we're going to start on time today because we have a lot of rich content, and I'm sure that people have lots of questions. So welcome to Electrifying Canada, what citizens want to need to accept change. Over the next hour, we'll be diving into Dr. Louise Comeau's recent public opinion research on what citizens think and need and what's missing from Canada's electrification conversation. So my name is Amber Bennett. I'm with the Climate Narratives Initiative. My colleague, Maria Granados, will be co-hosting with me, and the bulk of today's webinar will be spent in presentation and questions, but we'll be popping in and off. So I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda Nations and the Métis Nation 3, otherwise known as situated in Calgary. So we've got people joining us from today from all across the country. So I encourage you, while other people are joining, to pop into the chat and introduce yourself. I love seeing all of the different places where people are joining from. So please let us know your name, where you're joining from, your organization. And as I said, today's webinar is hosted or co-hosted through Climate Access and the Climate Narratives Initiative. And sometimes we might feel alone, but we're super excited to say that we had 215 people register for today. So I think a lot of us are very interested in this electrification conversation and how we can have that with Canadians. As I mentioned, we've got people joining from all kinds of different sectors. We've got federal policy makers, we've got ENGOs, we've got healthcare workers, so a real diversity, so that's very exciting. And for those of you who are just joining, again, I encourage you to take an opportunity, introduce yourselves in the chat, let us know where you're joining from and the lands that you call home. And before we jump in, one moment to thank our the funders who make this possible. So thank you to the McConnell Foundation, the Donner Canadian Foundation, and those foundations that contribute to the Clean Economy Fund. You're making this webinar possible, but also many other climate projects across the country. So today's webinar will include a presentation by Dr. Comeau, and then we'll have time for questions. So we like to use the Q&A function. I can't imagine anyone is not familiar with Zoom at this point, but it's down at the bottom of your screen. And so it's really helpful for us if you can keep your questions in a Q&A box rather than kind of blending them in through the chat. So this work is really focused for communicators. You know, we have a lot of engineers and modelers and economists that are telling us what needs to be done around the electrification space, but what citizens think and what citizens need and what's missing for them in terms of their acceptance of electrification is not well known. So I'm super excited by the work that Dr. Comeau's done. She hardly needs an introduction for most people. She's been a pioneer in this space in Canada for many years, as well as internationally. She directs the Conservation Council of New Brunswick's Climate Change and Energy Solutions Program. She has 30 years of experience in analyzing and developing climate change policy, communications, and solutions related programming for environmental groups. She holds a doctorate in environmental management focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from the University of New Brunswick. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to hand this over to Louise, and please feel free, folks, to pop in questions as they come up for you, and we have a nice bit of time at the end to work through those. So thank you so much, Louise, and over to you.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm really keen to make this presentation today, but also to have this conversation with you. And a number of you did send in some questions ahead of time, and I'll try to kind of address those as we go along. And I think if we get to the end and there are questions remaining, please don't hesitate to ensure that we address them. I'm going to cover the research that we did and why, concepts that focus in on community influence and community benefits, how people evaluate fairness, share with you an experiment we did around how to speak about this issue, what kind of narratives influence people's perceptions, some other of the research results, and make some communications recommendations. So like any research project, and I am this kind of interesting, I think, mix of drivers. I am a social scientist and I'm a campaigner. I'm an advocate, and I enjoy work on the communication side of things. I do policy work. And so I always bring research to our campaigns and to bring an evidence-based approach. And so therefore, its research starts with a question. And in this case, it started with a question about why some renewable energy projects fail. And that came from the experience we've had. We've seen it elsewhere in the country, but in this case, in New Brunswick, where two approved projects proposed under a program where NB Power was sponsoring the request for up to 80 megawatts of renewable energy. Two 20 megawatt wind projects were approved for northern New Brunswick and two little communities called Anse Bleu and Pokeshaw, and neither of them proceeded. And so I really wanted to understand more about what happened here and why did these projects fail. So the social scientist sets out on a quest. And the reason I wanted to dig deeper is, of course, as Amber's introduced, we've had this emerging conversation. Maybe for some of you it might be new, but increasingly over the last few years, there's been this growing understanding that one of the primary pathways to solving climate change is through this shift from fossil fuel use to more electricity as powering our daily lives and industry and activities. And so we call this process, this pathway, electrification. The issue of concern, though, and the motivation for the research is we're talking about a pace that's been unprecedented, a proportion that's unprecedented. And as if you work in this area at all, this work has been dominated by engineers and economists, and there's not been enough accounting, in my view, of the social side and people. So let me just kind of go through these quickly. In terms of pace, we're talking about a commitment by the federal government to policies and regulations that are to deliver what they call a net zero, I call zero or reaching near zero emitting electricity system in Canada in less than 15 years. So that is kind of a policy driver, political driver that's already bringing us into a connection with federal and provincial government discussions. There's also the question of proportion. If you're shifting from, say, using gasoline in the transportation sector and natural gas in industrial processes and in home heating, and you're replacing all of that with electricity, the modeling shows a significant increase in the size of the electricity system that will be needed to power that system. And in fact, in the questions that were submitted, there were two questions that said, I've been told that if we want to achieve this vision of electrification, we're talking about 5 or 6 Site C size projects. The Site C dam, just as an example, is 1,000 megawatts. And the current Canadian electricity system is about 140,000 megawatts. We're talking about building out 2 to 3 times that system. We're actually talking 5 or 6 sized projects. Nobody's really proposing a lot of new hydro in Canada. It's mostly wind and solar, but it's 5 to 6 times that size every year, every year. So proportion's a problem. And we know on the one hand that Canadians favor renewable energy. When you ask them in a kind of abstract kind of way, very, very strong support, 80, 90%, almost always. Yet at the level of projects and communities, we do see delay, and we do see opposition to projects. Sometimes that can be described as NIMBYism, and I know there's a few questions on that. The social scientists actually don't think NIMBYism exists. Just think about that as I'm presenting to you, and you might see some things that actually better reflect or better represent what people are going through. So what did I do? I'm a mixed method researcher, which means I like to do qualitative and quantitative work, which means I like listening to people, and then I take the things I hear and I think about what academics think about all that, and I convert it all into a survey. In this case, I did 7 focus groups across Canada, and a number of questions asked about the smaller scale, like solar on people's houses and so on. In this case, I was actually trying to understand the bigger scale project, the large wind projects, the large solar projects, trying to understand this almost obsession that's in play now about building out transmission to link provinces like BC and Alberta, to bring hydro to Alberta, for example, or Manitoba to Saskatchewan, or New Brunswick and Nova Scotia connected to Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. And so we coupled all of the people in the focus groups by that pairing, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, as well as a separate one for the Atlantic as a whole, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and BC and Alberta. That would have given us 4 groups, but we had 7. And the reason for that is that we separated males and females. And the reason for that is on a topic like this, and many topics are like this, that are perceived to be a little bit more technical. It doesn't take very long before the women stop talking in these sessions, and that's just not good at all. We want the women to participate and bring their story to the issue, even if they feel less secure about the technical side. And it was very much the case in our sessions. We did those focus groups in the first week of March, and then very quickly turned around a survey that we did across Canada, an online panel survey of 1,800 Canadians, representative across the country, and so on. So in that survey, we tested some of the results we saw in the focus groups, as well as some narratives. So let me just get your head now in the game, not the game, but in the perspective of a citizen who's being asked in focus groups, what do you think about these projects? How do you feel about them? What kind of influence might you want to have if you were looking at a project in your area? What kind of community benefits would you be thinking about? By virtue of asking these questions in that way, we are in a completely different headspace with respect to projects. And in one of the wonderful academics we encountered, Boudet, says that even asking these kinds of questions is in contrast to the traditional decide, announce, defend strategy of energy development. Instead, when we're asking about what you want, what you need, we're looking at work that encourages increased consultation, engagement, and collaboration. So that's the heart of the matter and the approach we took to this research. When we asked people how much influence should communities or citizens have over where projects are located, and we again, we're thinking about this because we know for one of the projects here in New Brunswick, it was the location, not the technology itself, that was the problem. And so people were very generous in their responses. Before I get to that, though, I just want to share with you what we defined in this case as community, remembering that while people will bring their personal experience and did indeed talk about solar on their roofs and things like that, we were also trying to get them to think about this from a social perspective, from a community perspective, broadly defined, to include projects that might be in or near their communities, on the edge of their communities, be in locations they might drive by and see on a regular basis. So when people were thinking about that, thinking about influence, they had very clear ideas about what they needed. They wanted to have access and standing in terms of processes to participate and to ensure that communities have a voice. For those of you that might think about things from justice terms and have a background in some of how academics define that. That's participatory justice. I would call it a fairness piece in terms of process. They also wanted, in terms of their standing and what happened in the process, to be able to make some decisions. They wanted to see that what they had to say had an actual influence on where projects were located, and they were very reasonable about what that might look like. Some said, look, we'd like to see maybe 2 or 3 options, and then we maybe get to vote or something. But other people said, look, we're not the final decision makers. We're happy to be consulted and provide our views. We want to know they were truly considered, but we know others may have to make a decision. So, lots of reasonableness there if we're respectful of people. And there was a general kind of, commentary that ran through all the focus groups that people are concerned in these processes about power imbalances, particularly from vested interests. And they worried that they were getting biased information. And it turns out that this too is a consistent thing that people ask for. As we've been talking to developers, they confirm that this is the case. People are saying, can there be neutral experts like academics or other scientists who could advise citizens so they know how to interpret the information that they're being given? When it comes to benefits, and we ask people what benefits, if any, should homeowners, communities, Indigenous communities expect when renewable projects are proposed? And in this case, when you get people thinking about benefits, it's kind of like a distributional piece of this, right? This is distributional justice, cost and benefits, who's getting what and who doesn't get what. And indeed, that's where people's minds really went to when we asked that question. And education came up as an important dynamic of this, because they needed to be on a level playing field in order to know what was the right kind of benefits that were appropriate for their community. But there were also personal and social financial benefits that people wanted to see and wanted to know about, whether they were possible for their community: jobs, economic partnerships, incentives or rebates, tax breaks, community sponsorships, and the environmental benefits were there as part of that. That was, important, but there were other benefits as well. The key driver of this discussion on benefits was the concern that there is a community impact without a community benefit. And so that equation absolutely matters, and it can come together in different ways. And again, people talked about community sponsorships, the possibility of lower property taxes, and it turns out that indeed that is the case in locations where these new projects are paying property taxes. There can be benefits to the communities. People talked about lower sales taxes possibly, or power rates, and that could have been even over the long term. It didn't have to be right at this moment. One of the key aspects here is this is coming from a place where people would really like to know that the power that's generated is actually power the community uses. Now, that's hard to do with electrons, but you get the idea, right? They want to know that we've done this, we're accepting this project, but there's some value to us. It's selfish. There's a collective social advantage that they're looking for. It wasn't just all about me. And for some people, community pride was also a part of it. I want to feel good about the fact that we're doing this project. We know that on transmission projects, there has also been opposition out on the East Coast. We've just experienced an example of that with Quebec trying to sell hydropower to Massachusetts and Maine turning them down. And these are not uncommon stories. So I've got the grumpy face there. And we had one narrative in the focus group that focused on transmission. I had several others that focused on electrification overall. And the feedback from the focus group participants on these little narratives were the feedback that was so important to designing the survey experiment, as well as I think it was done. So in this case, when we asked about transmission, people were kind of like, yeah, we get it, within limits. And I used an argument that is the typical argument that we hear, and it goes like this. Energy experts say we need transmission lines to increase the reliability of renewable energy, either to bring in hydropower when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, or when other storage technologies are not available. That's the standard kind of argument for the transmission piece. And participants said, yeah, we get it. We're open to sharing. We do it now for gas. We've got pipelines, here and there and everywhere. But it's kind of like a necessary evil. You need to show us that there are alternatives were considered, that we need to have this line, that we can't bury it. And they need to be reassured about their concerns about view issues and health effects. But again, back to this issue of, the power being power that's generated for somebody else and we don't get access to it. People are worried about transmission lines that generate power just for exports. And that don't generate any in-province advantage. And they're worried about it for security and sovereignty reasons. They're worried that if we become too reliant on electricity from out of province, does that make us vulnerable? Will the other province raise rates on us because they don't care about us as much? So a lot of that theme about community harm, if you will, and no community benefit comes up here again. When we, and in parallel to me doing this work, it's being fueled by our literature review. As I was reflecting on what it was that people were telling me in these focus groups, I really came to a point where it was, this is all about fairness. And in the academic literature, there is a very rich literature on social acceptance. And within that literature, there are some very good academics that have done some work on defining fairness in a much richer way than we normally do. When we ask someone if they think something is fair or unfair, we actually miss a lot of nuance. And generally, the academics say that when you just have a simple scale, fair to strongly, very, very fair to very unfair, or strongly agree something's fair to strongly disagree, you're actually thinking more about integrity. But there's more to fairness than that. This framework is actually on just one component of fairness, the distributional side. So you remember I talked about distributional justice, and that was the cost benefits and that kind of thing. This is 6 types of fairness that can be on people's minds just thinking about that cost benefit side of it. There are 2 additional kinds of fairness, which we've already talked about in terms of the process, the recognition fairness and participatory fairness. In this case, I'm just sharing with you this wonderful framework that we got from Linda Stagg and others. Linda is a well-known, very well-respected social psychologist and one of my personal environmental sociology heroes. And here she's looking at, with her colleagues, the 2 categories, fairness comparison and then fairness outcomes. And we've got 3 kind of blocks there: intrapersonal, meaning comparison of outcomes to myself, to me, so much more of a me referencing point, but also interpersonal comparison, and in this case, comparing the effects on me relative to others, or comparison of outcomes across groups. So in this case, we might think about, let's say, low-income groups. There's intergenerational comparison, so comparison across groups, including future generations, whereas the interpersonal is more about current generations. This is thinking about the future. On the right, we've got 6 potential fairness outcomes, and I can tell you they were all represented in the comments in the focus groups. And the beauty of this framework was I was able to use a scale in the survey to actually measure. So they are, in terms of intrapersonal, whether or not you're financially worse off. In terms of interpersonal, are you worse off relative to others? Is everybody equally affected? Is the effect proportional to income? Is the effect or outcome proportional to the contribution to the problem? And in terms of intergenerational, protection of nature, environment, and future generations. We're clearly going to come back to these things. So one question that many might ask, and at least I did, is, how does what we were doing at Conservation Council fit with other research? And just completely coincidental. And in fact, while this was all going on and this nature climate change study came out, Climate Outreach, who we also collaborate with, was also working on fairness. And what's interesting is, they found similar outcomes in terms of the importance of fairness as we move toward net zero policies. And I think what we've managed to do with our framework is get into a bit of the richness around that. But what we find here in this Nature Climate Change meta-analysis, which looks at many studies, in this case 51 papers covering 89 studies and involving more than 119,000 people, what comes to the top as the most important variables influencing public opinion on climate change solutions like regulations and taxes? What comes to the top? Fairness. The second one is effectiveness, and we know this is important from a lot of research that we are currently in a bit of a vulnerable place in society because people are concerned about climate, but they actually are not aware of what the most effective solutions are, whether they work, and whether we can afford them. So that effectiveness piece is an issue for us in Canada, and it matters. The third one is trust in implementing institutions, and I will come back to that. So keep this in mind: fairness, effectiveness, and trust. So in the survey, we measured, moving from simple ideas about concepts like fairness. We also used a richer scale around the concepts driving trust and skepticism. We measured fairness and acceptability. I used a simple fairness scale as well as our richer one. And acceptability of a clean electricity standard regulation. You'll see what the chapeau says when I get to the results. And we tested people's perceptions of fairness and acceptability after no exposure to a narrative and after exposure to one or another narrative. So 3 options on that. So let's just describe the trust dynamic here. Again, like fairness is a multidimensional concept. If you ask somebody again about this issue of do you trust somebody, is it are they trustworthy or not? We miss this idea of this is a simpler thing than it might look, but we miss these ideas that fall into categories called general trust, excuse me, and skepticism. On the left-hand side, you'll see some items, which I'll describe to you. And in this question in the survey, we asked people to strongly agree to strongly disagree whether or not the federal government had certain attributes with respect to their ability to regulate a non-polluting electricity system. So those attributes were: did they have the necessary skilled people to regulate? Were they competent enough to regulate? Were they acting in the public interest with regard to regulating? Were they making decisions about regulating in a way that is fair, providing all relevant information about regulating, or listening to what ordinary people think about that particular regulation? Now, these are concepts that can apply to any topic, just so you know. On the right-hand side are the skepticism items. So in this case, the federal government distorts facts in its favor regarding this regulation, is too influenced by provinces, utilities, and industry regarding regulation, and changes policies regarding regulation without good reasons. So when you're asking somebody about whether they trust or distrust something, or a policy or an idea, we're actually in this world and dealing with whether they think they're competent or reliable, that they have integrity, or whether they are biased and distort facts and so on. And what you see here from the results is we've got about a quarter of the sample, both on the general trust side, only a quarter saying they strongly agree that the feds have competencies and integrity and reliability, but also only a quarter saying they strongly agree that they distort or are too influenced or are unreliable. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us a couple things. One is that opinion isn't fully formed yet, which is a good thing. And in fact, when I looked at the results, far more of the people agreed than disagreed, except for listening to people and providing information. More people disagreed, and I think that's important. But generally speaking, 50% or so of the results were in these, what I call soft scores. So, slightly agreed to neutral to slightly disagree. So what I want to point out there is that trust is critically important, as we saw from that meta-analysis, and trust on in terms of government is not high, but it's also not hardened. And if we need to have trust in implementing institutions, we need to think about this issue as we're thinking about, in this case, the rest of this story on electrification. We'll come back to that. So we did this narrative experiment. It's one of the things I like to do, but I want to share a caveat. You know, these strategic framing experiments that a lot of folks do in the communications field, they are, you know, suggestive, right? They help us see where people might go in terms of reactions to things, but they're not changing the world, right? You don't, you know, you're not changing things on a permanent basis with an exposure of a few seconds, but the results are suggestive and they can help us. But it's always important to remember that we're not overclaiming here. And, you know, from a comms point of view, it's about the drip, drip, drip. And that means long-term and consistent messaging. And as I said, the focus groups the participants had no hesitation at all telling me what they didn't like. And of course, I'm not sitting there in the room with them, but I'm listening in, and the facilitator is guiding the conversation. And so I do feel I'm having, you know, an exchange, whether I'm doing it directly or not. And I can tell you absolutely that, and we know this as good communicators, but what was clear was that we do need to find narratives that have a balance between the need for clear, factual, and realistic statements, but to do so in a way without triggering arguments and skepticism and resentments. And that is not easy to do. And you'll see as we go through the results, some of the ways that we've tried to come to terms with that. The first way I tried to come to terms with that was in the way I designed the narratives for the experiment. So I've had one narrative that was kind of much more on that intrapersonal side, that was about more cost of living. We kind of help people see the story a little bit through their personal lens. Because of the kind of challenges we were getting in the focus groups from some people, depending on where they were, gender, and so on, some people thought we didn't need to talk much about climate change anymore, that we could be matter of fact. Some, you know, in the research has said because we have low understanding of effectiveness, that we should be showing momentum and providing examples and getting people to see that we can do these things. Because people kept arguing whenever we used an absolute number, you know, maybe we should use a range of numbers, and that first narrative included references that should be triggering around concepts of fairness. The second one, I tried, of course, to build, even though each narrative is exactly the same word length, I tried to build a bit of a different tone. This one leaned a little bit more collective in terms of its referencing, a little bit more talk about the social and personal benefits relative to others, a little bit more detail on climate change, used some absolutes, but didn't go overboard, and again, ended with fairness. So you don't want to have too many differences between the two, so there's similarities, so that I can get a sense of what caused any variation. So what happened? The first thing to know is that relative to a control group, and just in case folks don't do this kind of work, I had 1,800 people. They were divided into 3 equal groups. And one group, the control group, never saw the narratives. They were just asked the questions that came after the narratives for the other 2 groups. And the second group saw the self-referencing narrative, and a third group saw just the collective narrative. After that, they were asked about whether they thought, they asked to react to a question that introduced the idea that the federal government would be is implementing a clean electricity standard to get us to basically a near zero emitting electricity system by 2035, and asked whether they thought that was a fair policy. They also were asked in the richer scale of fairness whether they thought it was personally unfair. And I'll show you the full scale on the next slide, but I just wanted to put these 2 together because there's 2 ways that fairness showed up here. First thing to say is that having a narrative at all, providing some detail at all, actually increased fairness perceptions overall. But, and this comes up a lot, and I argue this with so many people so many times, especially when people are doing programs around efficiency and they want to sell the program primarily on financial savings. It's an okay thing to do, but there can be consequences. And one of them, in terms of self-referencing, is that people felt that the policy was actually also more unfair. So we had some increase in fairness relative to the control group, but we also had more people thinking it was unfair compared to the other narrative, which also had higher fairness, but it also had fewer people saying it was unfair. And that's important. And they also felt it was less unfair relative to others. And so in terms of, if I'm scoring things here at this point, in terms of fairness perceptions, the collective narrative did better. Here's that scale that looked at all those fairness outcomes. And the questions were, people with low incomes will be affected more than people with high incomes. People who consume the most will be affected most strongly. That's proportional to contribution, right? This is the future generations in terms of nature, the environment, future generations will be protected. My financial situation will get worse, which I showed you on the previous slide. This one here. I will be worse off compared to others. I just showed you. And everybody will be affected to the same extent. So there's the 6 outcomes. And what happened? Well, this is, to me, very interesting. First of all, both narratives in the third row, nature and the environment, future generations, both narratives statistically improved people's perceptions of that social benefit to future generations, which is great. So again, either one will do the job. But remembering self-referencing makes people feel a little bit more unfair. We want to watch for that. And that you see in that second from the bottom. I will be worse off compared to others. But on the top 2, I want to point something out, that no matter what group you were in, a good 4 and 10 or more really felt that people with low incomes would be affected more than people with high incomes. And that's not what people want. That's a social concern. I would put it in the category of perhaps core value, that justice issue, that issue of protecting people, the most vulnerable people, is important to everybody. And the same thing, people who consume the most will be affected the most. There was no difference among the groups. So the question is, in this little experiment, what did we get? Well, we got some good understanding that narrative helps in terms of describing the story. And I'll share with you, of course, what the story is. And that we can make people's perception of fairness worse if we're not careful in how we communicate. On acceptability, remembering acceptability of this policy, right? This policy to have a net zero grid by 2035. What we saw again was both narratives increased acceptability, but only the collective narrative had the lowest level of unacceptability. And these are statistically significant. And so again, this idea that a collective narrative about the social benefits for a collective action problem is good communications alignment. I'm just going to show you a couple of little things here because there were some demographic differences in terms of how people reacted. The one thing to say is that this self-referencing narrative, and thinking about it from a more personal referencing point of view, the Greens and the NDP in terms of political orientation liked this one better. They had higher levels of fairness. But if you lived in the suburbs and you were a visible minority, you did not like that particular narrative. On the collective side, it was more favored by Liberals, Conservatives, undecided voters, the Bloc, city and rural dwellers, and Francophone and Indigenous. Again, for me, I lean collective on these reactions. On acceptability, again, higher for some folks. The Greens again come out here, some of the provinces, but again, suburban dwellers did not. They had lower levels of acceptance on the self-referencing one. So that's an important insight. And the same group, again, had higher acceptability scores from a demographic point of view, from the collective narrative. All right, that's all of that I'm going to share with you on those surveys. That's enough of those kinds of numbery things. So let's get into what does it all mean in terms of some of the advice that I took away from this work from myself, and that I'll share with you. You may find of interest to yourself in terms of the work you do. The first thing I would say is let's be sensitive to the need to avoid triggering debate and skepticism. People are ready for this conversation about solutions. And we can enter into that conversation without kind of being so adamant about, it's this number, right? Or this is the only solution. And so, concepts like talking about one solution to climate change is electrification, that the new electricity system is cleaner, right? We'll often say it's clean. Well, is anything ever really truly clean, right? We know that from all the debates that are going on that should be going on. We can also minimize debates by being careful about the numbers we're using or the years we're referencing. For example, one of the narratives talked about, the IPCC, and we've got less than 10 years. And I say again, because I feel I was personally there, but the participants spent quite a bit of time arguing about, well, it can't be 10 years anymore because we've been talking about it for 2 or 3 years. So it was like, let's just talk about we need action now, not trigger that in people. And also because people's sense of effectiveness, which showed up in that meta-analysis as being so important, because they don't know what the right solutions are, providing concrete examples that are comparatives, that give people a sense. For example, in this case, wind and solar are cheaper than coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. People were like, oh, I didn't know that. And so they really are looking for those little bits, not too over the top details, but enough to give them a sense of relativeness, to help them, kind of know what direction we might be going in. It won't surprise you, given the research and the results and so on, to say that I think our communications need to speak to fairness outcomes. These conversations tend to be very technical, very technology focused, and I actually just don't think that's our problem. I think we've got a social challenge in front of us, and if we want to bring people along to what is unprecedented in terms of potential build out, that this is not an engineering issue alone. This is about the social side of things, and fairness matters. I think we also need to practice communicating this momentum. There were lots of challenges about some of the narrative language that talked about, we are making progress, there are projects happening, but they didn't want you to go so far as to sound like a politician. And so there's a sweet spot there between being specific about examples, but not being so over enthusiastic that we sound not credible. So there's a balance there. I also think we need to really test, and that'll be work we do, I hope, in the future, but this issue of people's perception of sharing and security and sovereignty. It comes up in this work through transmission, but it also can come up through the pathways that we choose. Some provinces are arguing over what we call more of a hard path, in the sense of, is it going to be nuclear and more gas that backs up this renewable story? Or is it more renewables connected to hydro through other connections like transmission, but more efficiency and that kind of thing? So there is really an argument developing out there over these two visions. So don't have to read this, just let me read it to you. You can just close your eyes for a moment. Here is what I think, and I'm calling it a narrative arc. It's a bit more detailed than like a narrative, touchstone element. But it's the story that we would tell, not explicitly in every way, but that we would be trying to make sure we cover these points. And they won't surprise you if you've been reading climate access documents about the challenge, the pathway, and the benefits. Well, here's the challenge. Electricity made by burning coal, oil, and gas pollutes the air and makes weather extreme. We see how floods, heat waves, and forest fires harm the health and safety of Canadians. Scientists tell us the world has to change how we use energy now if we are to keep people and nature safe. One way to solve climate change is to build non-polluting sources of electricity to power electric vehicles and transit systems, our homes and businesses. The pathway. We need billions of dollars of investment to renew Canada's electricity system. Electricity made using wind turbines is cheaper than using coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. When transmission lines connect provinces, non-polluting power reliably reaches Canadians. The benefits. To keep power bills affordable, though, we must use electricity efficiently. We can pay less to power an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline vehicle. Securing these energy savings costs money. Canadians need financial incentives, so electric vehicles and retrofitting homes are affordable. We need to train workers, so we have the expertise to retrofit homes and businesses. We also need to ensure citizens and communities have a say about where renewable energy projects and transmission go, the size of projects, and have a chance to partner and profit from projects. So this essentially is the collective narrative that we used in the survey and edited a little bit based on the results, just to take it to that next kind of level. So just some recommendations around the policy side of things, that I think what we see here in terms of the richer sense of fairness is that this question of defining fairness is actually relative to others, to future generations, and that we need to kind of keep positioning our thinking and our discussions and our communications around that. There has to be some benefit. People want to know that they're not worse off relative to others. That's important. But it's not just about me. It's about me relative to others, and others relative to what's fair to them. And that means protecting low income to moderate income households, ensuring that policy has progressive effects, which means proportional to, say, the contribution to the problem, whether that's at the consumption level or ability to pay in terms of income. And I think, as we get into this story about electricity and electrification and this build out, which is going to be a very engineering and technology focused story. And, if I were to take a gendered lens to it, I'd say a very male kind of, thing. I really think for those of us who do a different kind of communications, a different kind of campaigning, that we should be seen to be defending and demanding communities and citizens' right to access, influence processes, to be educated, and to be have expertise available to them to ensure that recognition and participatory justice fairness is there. So on that slide, you get basically all 8 kind of fairness dimensions kind of laid out.
Hi, Louise. Sorry to interrupt. We just have about 15 minutes left in the webinar.
Oh dear, sorry. Okay, I will finish right up for you. Sorry about that. I didn't realize I was speaking more slowly today. So I'm just going to talk about the trust piece and then go into the final piece here. There's some pieces on language that's here when you see the deck, and I would simply say that we do have to build trust in institutions, and we need to be careful about how we're criticizing government and other institutions in how we do that. And one of the ways we can do this from a policy perspective is to press that any federal government money is conditional on these fairness outcomes. And that would be my key kind of piece to talk about there. And you can look at that in more detail. We're doing 2 case studies now. They'll be published in the fall. So if you want more, and there's a link here to a little video that we've done. It's a 41-second video that shows this whole research in a nice little thing. And I won't show it because we're out of time. And I will leave it there. How's that? Let me just pause that. I'll just pause it and stop sharing. Sorry about that, Maria.
Thank you so much, Louise.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Louise. So we have a number of questions coming in. One question is around, sorry, it's from Derek Simpson. We also had a question coming from another in advance around from Tim, Tim from SFU, around effective ways to influence large power companies. For example, BC Hydro. Robert was asking around how might these insights apply when speaking to decision makers, so politicians, business leaders, community leaders, as opposed to the general public. So I think there's kind of that sense of, large decision makers, general public.
Absolutely. And so these results apply. So the way that we're applying this work is basically to decision makers and to regulators, and essentially saying you have to design these policies and approaches in ways that ensure fairness outcomes. So what that means is utilities not doing RFPs in ways that lead to a project being announced without the public ever knowing about it ahead of time. It means that federal dollars are conditional on community benefits agreements, right? So, in terms of utilities, you're worried about BC Hydro, try living in New Brunswick. We've got a very difficult situation here, very little consultation that goes on. But we do have a system that's going to grow. And so one of the things I've been saying is, we've got to make sure that what happens is fair, but it also has to be diverse. If you're going to double the size of the electricity system, which frankly strikes terror in my heart, we need to be able to accommodate all sorts of options. Community owned and operated power. We need First Nations owned and operated power. We need Crown Corporation or private sector led power. There should be room for all of that, with the caveat that the outcomes have to be done in the kind of ways that I'm talking about. The key point I want to make on how realistic it is that this issue of fairness and community benefits agreements and all of that, it's happening with First Nations projects. Those projects are working. The question is not to, for me is, this is a human need. It's a human desire. We want that to apply to all citizens. And it's a model that we can replicate. So what they're doing for First Nations communities, whether it's BC Hydro or MP Power or whatever, should be the way that they operate for all projects in all communities.
Thanks, Louise. Question here from Patricia Lane. She asks if you have any thoughts about the power of disinformation campaigns polluting the integrity of citizen engagement. So your sense on
yes, that. Yes. So, we are quite seized with the anti-wind issues, and that's why we're doing all of this research. And so one of the things we've got going right now is community-based interviews. We're actually door knocking in the 2 communities where the projects failed, and we'll release case studies. What the anti-wind campaign does have, in this case, anti-wind as an example, does have features of this fairness question. But it also has features of disinformation for sure. In northern New Brunswick, there was concern that wind would actually, I don't understand it. If somebody knows, they can help me think it through, but that it would actually deplete their water wells, that it would dry the water wells out so they wouldn't have water to drink. And so we need to understand that, but we also need to understand what it's like to live with wind. We had Pincher Creek representative just happened to be in our focus groups, and it's like not easy. There's noise issues to deal with. There's the red light issue at night on all of these turbines. It turns out NAV Canada can actually shift those lights for planes, which is for them, to radar activated only when planes come and just don't want to bother. So that's what I mean about defending, right? That we need to be pressing the utilities and the regulators on these aspects that give voice to citizens who don't have voice in the places they should have voice. And we should be seen to be defending their right for both participatory and recognition justice, as well as fairness outcomes on the distributive side.
You kind of mentioned this in your introduction, but I just wanted to kind of go back to it. So it's a question here from Alan from Environmental Defense. How best to counter messages of NIMBY concerns around wind farms?
Great. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to say is that, and I'm happy to share these articles, you can just reach out to me. But the social scientists working on social acceptance actually dispel the idea that NIMBYism exists. That NIMBYism is, as perceived and defined to be selfish, a selfishness issue, is actually not what's at play. That these fairness dimensions are at play, perceptions about the technology or risks about the technology, so risk perception, fairness perceptions, all of these things are at play here. And so I guess what I'm trying to argue is that where we see projects succeed, where community benefits agreements are in place, where people participated and influenced decision making, that we can see projects go forward. Where we see that being opposed is where scale has been too much, pace has been too much, people didn't have a say, they put them in stupid places like wetlands or too near homes. There are legitimate reasons people are reacting, and it's not just that they're selfish. And so I think the literature has a lot, and the academics have a lot to offer us here on a richer understanding of what's going on.
Thanks, Louise. A question here from Derek Simpson, and I think certainly one in light of the Fueling Canada campaign that's out there around how can community groups work and encourage developers to choose electric over natural gas in buildings?
That's a great point. We're actually just building up capacity nationally with the colleagues I work with on electricity issues to deal with this gas issue. The last thing we need to be doing is heating with gas. I mean, that's clearly not the issue here. Not being an expert in, because we don't have gas here in our part of the country for home heating, it's all electric. Not being an expert in the area, I mean, I would immediately go to, this is clearly a regulatory issue that we need to essentially ban gas from home heating. Yes, deep canvassing. I will be happy that you raised the issue of deep canvassing. That's kind of what we've been doing and what we've got going in our community work right now. Absolutely. So that is an inadequate answer to a very hard question.
I'll have two more questions. So one more here from Robert Tremblay. So looking at the recent New England Clean Energy Connect failure at the Maine referendum, what do you think could have been done better to get buy-in from Maine residents?
So part of what, as I understand this issue and how it's showing up in the literature is, and in fact, my partner's family lives in Maine. And so they were here while this issue was being debated. And they were pretty clear that they felt that Maine was exactly what the participants told us in the focus groups, that the Maine transmission process was going to cut through their forests to no benefit to Maine. Quebec would benefit, Massachusetts would benefit, and they would not benefit at all. And so very much in keeping with this research, showing you exactly how rich these concepts are. The other aspect of it was there was a very strong gas campaign against the transmission because the gas companies don't want the renewables coming in. They are fighting for gas supply. So that was a big part of it as well. A lot of disinformation, I understand, from the gas lobby.
Thanks. So finally, Louise, with all of this in mind, and you know that we have a lot of advocates and grassroots groups on the ground, what advice would you give grassroots volunteers right now in light of the research that you've done?
I would say that, if you're thinking about fairness, I don't know about you, but when I'm thinking about fairness, my heart is more empathetic, right? That we're not standing outside of this conversation and this fact and that fact and this fact. We're listening, right? We're listening to what people's concerns are and hearing them. The framework and the research can help you listen and hear what is it they're talking about. Oh, that's what that fairness is. They're worried about this and they're worried about that. And we acknowledge their legitimate fears and concerns and defend them as something that should actually be desired. I have no reason to suspect that, in my opinion, if the people in Osceola in northern New Brunswick did not like the location for that project, it should have been moved. That's it. It should have been moved. And it never was considered. And that's not fair. So I think we do a lot. And I think we build trust in our communities for us and our work if we can be empathetic and hear them from their fairness perspectives.
I love that point. Thank you. Well, I think that is about the time that we have today. Lots of comments in the chat around how fantastic the work is, how helpful it's been. For our part, we will make the recording available and not to put you on the spot, Louise, but if possible, we'd love to be able to share a version of the deck out for people.
Yes.
Great. And
Yes.
as a part of that, we'll prepare a summary blog to kind of pull out some of the key points and make it easy for people. So once again, thank you so much, Louise, for doing this work, for sharing it. And we look forward to some of the follow-up research that you've talked about. I'm coming away with a renewed sense of the need for listening and empathy and really better understanding what is fair and what's behind people's reaction to the path that we have to go. So we will share this recording, we will share the deck, and that'll be coming into your mailboxes soon. So thank you so much, everyone. And lovely to see so many familiar faces and new faces on today's webinar, and have a good remainder of your day.
We would also really appreciate your feedback if you could take a moment to fill out the Survey Monkey that's going to pop up at the end of the presentation here. So thank you so much.
Take care. I'm gonna go get you something.